All right. Welcome to you all. If we could be seated and get on with our meeting. We had the microphones being connected just a moment ago, but it looks like that's all been taken care of. Welcome to you all to the Monday, October 15th, 2018 work session of the Falls Church City Council. We are delighted you're here with us this evening. We're also delighted to have our folks from Recs and Park Advisory Board with us who'll be joining us shortly at the table, so thank you all for coming out. Our first topic on the agenda is Big Chimneys Park update, and maybe this is appropriate time for have all the members of the Recreation and Parks Advisory Board. Would you all like to come and join us at the table? Thank you all for coming out this evening and for your fine work, assisting us with parks and recreation issues here in the city. So, Mr. Shields, who's going to do the update? Is it going to be staff or the advisory board? What was the plan?
Thank you, Mayor, members of council. So, as the council knows, we like to have sort of regular, ongoing touching base with the boards and commissions. With the city, and so this is an opportunity to do that with the Rec and Parks Advisory Board. We do have a specific item, which is an update on Big Chimneys Park, and so Danny, what is the choreography of this? Did you want to have a staff report first, or directly with the advisory board first?
I think to have that discussion with the advisory board and for the first part of it, I think is the best way to go about it, and then staff can jump in as needed.
Okay, so just as in a quick summary, we've been working the design for Big Chimneys Park. It is the site plan is going through the Planning Commission, and the plans are well advanced, and we have estimates for them. And so, sort of one of the key things we're wrestling with, and you'll hear about this from the Rec and Parks Advisory Board, is that our professional cost estimating does show that the project is coming in about $350,000 above the budget allocation. And if council will recall, the budget for this project was $1 million, and that was paid for through a portion of the sale proceeds for the property where the Harris Teeter 301 West Broad building stands today. And so that's a quick overview, and so we'll turn it over to Mr. O'Hara for discussion of the planning process for the park and the budget shortfall, and we'll go from there.
That's good. Thank you much. Welcome.
Thank you. Charlie O'Hara, currently chair of the Advisory Board of Recreation and Parks, and hopefully one day I'll be reappointed since I am currently in the hiatus state, but I understand we'll take care of that next month, hopefully. I've been on the advisory board for 28 years. Little history of this park. Mr. Shields has given you some. As you know, our parks are in our certain location generally for a reason, and that reason is because nobody else could figure out how to develop them. So our parks are in wet areas, as is Big Chimney. Big Chimney was anticipated to be redeveloped with the city center process. And as you may recall, back in the mid-2005, 2006, $300,000 was allocated from the city center to improve Big Chimneys. We know what happened to that. It went away. It was expected to be redeveloped because part of the city center surrounded almost all of Big Chimneys because it included the bowling alley, which is directly adjacent to Big Chimneys. When that fell through, as Mr. Shields said, $1 million was allocated from the sale of the property which developed into Harris Teeter, and since that time, we've been working on developing the project. The thought, at least from the board standpoint, is that this would be an urban park-looking area. It's not going to be like Howard Herman with trees and stuff because it's going to be surrounded. You have the Winter Hill development on one side with houses. You have the bowling alley on one side. You have the units on Shirley Street. So it's fully expected that this area is going to be redeveloped, so it will be more of an urban area as anticipate active use, relaxing use, walking trails, being able to sit and eat your lunch because there'll be some offices going around there. As the design went forward, At the 30% design, which is one of the documents you were given, which was dated July 26, 17, you'll see that there were some thoughts as to what would go in there, and that would be a pavilion, some trails, playground equipment. There'd be multiple connections to Winter Hill and our area. Are you going to pull that up? Yeah, that's the one. That's the one. If you can see that on the right side of it, there's a nice entrance off of Annandale Road. The thought was, would there be traffic calming? There'd be a raised pedestrian walkway over from the Harris Teeter area. There'd be traffic calming in there. You'd enter the park through a nice bricked area and one of the thoughts is that the elevation of the park would be lowered. Right now there's a berm there along Annandale Road. The elevation would be lowered so you'd flow directly from Annandale Road into the park. You'd walk in and there'd be a pavilion that you could walk through or you could walk around, and then you'd have green space, and then you'd enter, as you move from right to left there, you'll see the playground equipment would be there. And then there'd be the multiple trails connecting into Winter Hill. That's the 30% design. When they looked at that, it was kind of decided, that's going to be more than we kind of think we can afford. So at the 60% design, it was again, it was modified. The entrance is much less grand. The pavilion that was discussed is much less grand. It's moved off to the side. No longer are there multiple connections between Winter Hill and the park. So a design that is been significantly decreased from what staff had come up with from the initial design in 17. Now we're into 2018. So with this 60% design, staff went forward and tried to get some cost estimates. And that's when one of the factors that came in was originally the thought was the stormwater management portion, we'd be able just to move a little bit down into Shirley Street. Well, it turns out in order to take care of the amount of water on this property, you have to move much further down into Shirley Street in order to meet the water requirements. So it turns out the stormwater management portion of this project, of a $1 million park project, the stormwater management portion is around $300,000. So about 30% of the budget then has to be allocated for stormwater management. So with that, staff had to take this design, and when they got the prices, this design is when it went out to look at the price, it comes out to about 1.25. But the problem with that is it didn't have even lights included in it. So when you add the lights into it, it's about $1,350,000. And as I think everybody can realize, lights are essential. One for aesthetics, one for safety, and one for security to have in there. So what's kind of being proposed now is this document. It's been reduced even a little bit further. If you go to the next one, you can see we don't have the same kind of sketch, but it's similar in paths and stuff, but it's been reduced by some of the equipment. You know, the neighborhood has been looking for this project for over 10 years since the city center project went into effect. It's time to move forward with doing it, but the question is how with the money allocated. And to recall, this isn't a situation where staff designed a project and then asked for the money to implement it when they had a cost estimate. This is a situation where the money was allocated previously and staff is trying to work within that money. Now, I got some interesting thoughts as to Big Chimney. There's a couple things I'd like to do. One is I went through and tried to figure out, can you pass those around? When have we had CIP spending on the various projects, parks around here? So I went through and I have given you a sheet of all our parks with the dates of when we did CIPs on them. You can see Cherry Hill was just done last year. Larry Graves is scheduled to be done next year, and I hope I brought enough. But Big Chimneys hasn't had any CIP money spent on it since the mid-1990s, which is, you know, it's its time to have it done, and it's time to have it done well. Another interesting factor when I looked at it is this is probably the centrally located park for our population centers. There are recently approved or built are approximately 1,035 units within 0.3 of a mile of this. That's Pearson Square, Lincoln Hill, the West Broad, and the Broad and Washington project. Over 1,000 units within 0.3 of a mile of this project. Not only that, but you have over 400 existing units in Winter Hill alone within 0.2 of a mile of this project. You have almost 1,500 households within 0.3 of a mile of this park. How many households do we have in the city? 4,000? 4,500? 5,000? So almost 30% of the household units in the city live within 0.3 of a mile of this project. If you're looking at $1 million, that's about $750 per unit living within 0.3 of a mile of this. If you look at $1.3 million, $1.4 million, you're talking about $1,000 per unit within 0.3 of a mile of this project. So this project's time has come, both for the way it's existed, the promises that have been made to the neighbors, and also the need to improve the area. These people have been playing in a mosquito area for many years. So yes, the stormwater management should be done. It should be repaired. It should be taken care of. But the amenities provided to this park should not be lost because of the stormwater management portion of it. So I guess the question is, how do you want to handle it? Do you want to get this taken care of at one time, which means additional funds are necessary? If you don't want to do it at one time, what's going to be lost? Are you going to put a park in there with no playground equipment? I don't think the neighborhood wants that. Are you going to put a park in there without lights? I don't think for safety's sake that wants to be done. You know, I look at one small portion, because when I look at this, when the design came back, they wanted to, one of the ways to save money was to put an asphalt trail in there instead of concrete trails. We have a lot of parks in the city with asphalt trails. It's a small matter. I know, it's about $50,000. It's a great way to save money. But I look at it and I think the only way you can get away with that is because you're the city. If any other developer walked up to you and said, we want to put asphalt trails on our development because we can save $50,000 that way instead of putting concrete sidewalks, you'd look at them and say, you're crazy. You're going to put concrete sidewalks in there. And I think this is an urban-looking park. It should have a different feel. And it should be well done because of its location and the ability. So as a board and as staff, you know, Kim has done yeoman's work trying to get this money down, but Kim's between a rock and a hard place. She's trying to advise us, yet she also works with Public Works and with stormwater management. So it's a question, and the board realized this question. The board asked you all in July, what can we do with this situation? We sent you a memo, and we haven't heard back. And that's what we need is a response from council as to how to move forward. We know money's tight. We know it's going to be tough to move forward with this, but we kind of think it needs to be done. Here's another little project. I should have handed that early. That shows you what's around this, where the numbers come from as to where everything is and how this park is centrally located. You know, right now it's next to the bowling alley. I kind of expect at some point that'll be redeveloped, so it'll be actually adjacent to more development. So it's the time to do this project right. I'll be glad to answer any questions. And Bill, who's a member of our board also, if he wants to address, you had other members who hope to be here but are not able to.
Yeah, no, all I would just say is a hearty amen. I think that I'm brand new to the board, not to the city and not to the issues, but to the board. And the thing that was most striking to me when I first learned about it was just this notion that what we're doing is taking, you know, approximately a third of the amount of money that is available to build a park and spending it on stormwater. It has to be done. I mean, the park can't go on top of the swamp, but it really does feel like that should be addressed, and then the best park we can get for the money should be put on top of it.
All right, thank you very much. Do any of you have anything to add?
I think Charlie pretty much summarized everything from beginning to end. But where we started with this park was really with the master plan and speaking with the Rec and Parks Board and the community and planning staff to try to figure out, what do we want out of this park? What does the community want? What are the most important things? And a couple of things that came out were mainly the equipment, playground equipment, solving the stormwater management problem, and really providing a nice pedestrian way between kind of two large development areas in the city, between the Tinner Hill and Pearson Square, and then the Harris Teeter development. We saw this as kind of a nice pedestrian way through the city to link those different developments. One of the other things that came up was having a nice kind of entry feature along Annandale Road, as Charlie said, to kind of create that more almost urban area at the very front of the park to kind of tie into that development. And that's what we wanted to do, that's what we tried to do. And at each stage of development, we got cost estimates and we cut back. We started cutting back at each time we got those cost estimates. And at the 60% stage, which is shown right here, that's what was actually submitted for site plan. Because we had done some major value engineering, so we felt comfortable submitting it for site plan. While it was under site plan review, I actually had a contractor give me preliminary quotes because I knew it was tight. And I wanted to get a better feeling for how much this project was going to cost, and construction costs have been going up. And unfortunately, even with that cutback, the prices from the actual general contractor still came in at above $350,000. So those are numbers from the industry, not just cost estimators. And so rather than just coming here and saying we're short, I did come up with a plan to try to cut back some more costs. I was thinking, how can we at least build some of the features that are most important to the community, which is solving the stormwater management problem and installing the new play equipment. So essentially, with this draft, we're just building the south half of the park. We're putting in the play equipment, we're putting in the stormwater infrastructure, but we're leaving the section along Annandale Road kind of untouched. The existing entrance would remain the same, and we'd just tie in the new asphalt trail to that existing entrance, and then the north end of the park would, if we don't have additional funding, would just have to be constructed in a second phase or at a later date, as well as the lighting. I would think if you want the ultimate build-out to be with that plaza that ties into the crosswalk, you wouldn't really want to install the lights until that trail alignment is done. So that's where we are. If we're going to stay within the current funding, we can really only build the bottom part of the park. But that still provides ADA accessible entrance from Winter Hill, provides additional landscaping and new play equipment, and solves the stormwater drainage issues.
So the only thing I would like to add to those very well put pieces of comments is that something that typically gets asked in these kinds of meetings is how involved the public was. And I will say that it's been going on so long that we've had 3 different council representatives represented at some of these meetings that we've had with the public, and the public has been extremely involved. I'd like to think that they've really shaped this to where it is today. We started with our original master park planning process back in 2007, 8, 9, somewhere in there. And then we've actually redone that master park planning process with the community involved throughout that process. And they have been involved in every step along the way. In fact, they have someone with the Winter Hill homeowners group has been staying right up side by side with Kim as she works along with this, making sure that all their groups that they meet with know what is happening over there. So the community has been involved every step of the way.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Shields, do you have anything to add? Okay, Ms. Hardy, question?
Thank you. Thank you, Charlie and staff. As your parks liaison, I know how hard you guys have been working at trying to shave this project down, so I appreciate all the work on that. 2 questions on the value engineering things. One, I saw that the raised crosswalk is no longer in scope across Annandale. And I know traffic calming has been a big concern for folks in the Winter Hill neighborhood especially, and along Annandale. That part of Annandale is just pretty wide, especially when people are crossing across to Harris Teeter. How critical do you all think that is, or was that, it probably was not an easy decision to take that out?
Right, that was something that we actually cut out earlier in the process. The thought was that that improvement could be done as part of the traffic calming that's going to be done along Annandale Road, along with that Gundry Drive intersection. We have money coming in FY 2020 to start the traffic calming improvements along that Annandale Road section. So that was one of the things that we kind of shifted to that other project, a traffic calming
Yes, I want to make sure our left hand's talking to our right hand, that we make sure that we have that commitment that NTC will take care of that need, because I don't want to forget about it and say, oh, we're going to take it out of scope of this one, and then actually not take care of it.
Right, and we actually did have our engineers and architects design that bump out of the curb and the crosswalk, a preliminary design, and that's been given to the gentleman who's working on those neighborhood traffic calming improvements, the person who's in charge of that. So we are coordinating with each other.
Great. And then on the stormwater front, so I know that I know the park personally, so it's very wet. I saw rain garden was also taken out of scope. Is that going to impact, I guess, how dry or wet the park will be? Or do we think the other stormwater improvements could help it?
Right, we couldn't install the rain garden because the soils wouldn't infiltrate. And generally when that happens, you can put under drains underneath the rain garden, but the problem is you need to tie that into a storm sewer structure. But the storm sewer structure is very shallow down on Shirley Street. We don't have enough we don't have enough gravity or elevation, I guess, to put under drains under the rain garden and tie it into the storm sewer infrastructure. So there just wasn't a way to build that. So right now we have inlet structures, like small grate inlets throughout the park to pick up the water, get it into the pipe, and take it out of the park.
So on stormwater, I think last time this came up in July, I had asked the question, given that so much of your budget needs to go towards stormwater, as whether there was any potential for a stormwater fund to help support this project. But I understand that at the time our discussion, I think it was either Cindy or Wyatt, said that generally parks rank pretty low in terms of the ranking and priority of how to use stormwater money. Is that still our current thinking?
It is. So the mission of the Stormwater Fund is to do projects that mitigate flooding on private property or built property, or to improve water quality. And so for a kind of a boggy area in a park, that's and draining it really doesn't meet kind of the main things that we're trying to do with the Stormwater Fund. And for those projects to try to mitigate flooding at people's property, that budget is fully subscribed and then some on the projects that are slated to try to address those issues.
So if we were trying to use money from stormwater, it would be what, like how many years, I guess, of projects do we have in the queue right now before we could get to, if we were to use stormwater money, like indefinitely? Like it would never rise above high enough?
It started raining the night you asked. It stopped.
That's about right.
Yeah.
The issue is that a lot of, those projects, they're in that watershed management plan, so we've already engaged with neighbors. We've kind of set expectations those projects are going to move forward, and so stopping those projects just has consequences that we think would be, important and worthy of consideration. So we'd prefer not to do that. That's been the rationale. So we respect the fact it's all taxpayers' money. We want to use it the best way, but that's the way those funds have been allocated.
So given that's not a potential option, I guess I personally would love to see this happen, because between, I think, Charlie's data on the number of residences, benefits, the fact that we made commitments to the neighborhood when the development happened, I'd love to see this go through. I remember that partially this park was going to be offset by the sale of the Harris Teeter property. Is that the entire $1 million, or is there other proffer money coming in from the Rushmark project?
There was an additional $50,000, and that was used as part of the planning process for the project.
Okay,
So
that-
one
that
million
used up all that.
50. That's right.
And I don't want to count chickens before they hatch, but from Founders Row, I think we're getting about $150,000, I think, in proffer money there. Has that been earmarked for something already?
So yeah, I can speak to that. We have put an earmark for it in one of our other parks that really hasn't had anything happen in a long time, and that was going to go in over at Berman Park. That money has not been, it has not been absolutely set aside. That money could potentially go to help this. That money won't become available until after certificate of occupancies have been given for that project. So that's a little ways down the road.
2020 or so. And then the last idea was, I lost my train of thought. It's between proffer money, end of year surplus. I think we just talked about the budget amendment last time. What was our end of year surplus going to be?
What was their end of the year revenue surplus?
For the general fund? The unassigned fund balance is 6.1 million. And for fiscal year 18 was 762,000, sorry.
Thank you.
And that's underspending and revenue.
Yeah,
So that was the total.
that was the total. The underspending was a smaller portion, primarily close to 600,000 was revenues.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Duncan?
Thank you. This is actually a topic that I have not sat in any meeting, so forgive me if my questions are elementary. So, talk to me about the lights. Is it a little unusual for us to have lights in a park like this? The idea that if we install these, this would be a pathway that would connect populated areas between West Broad and tax analyst Orso area.
It's going to be a pathway whether you have lights or not.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, most of our parks say they close at dark, but most of our parks do have lights in them. I mean, Cavalier Trail gets you from, Maple Avenue to Westmoreland and has lights occasionally, as well as the tennis courts. Charity Hill has lights in them as we realized when we had to move one for the playground equipment.
Mm-hmm.
So most of our lights there, this is intended on being a cut through to be able to get through. It is right now, it's just you do it in the dark. So one of the thoughts that staff did in order to keep the money down is they would remove the lights, and they would then, whether you put the conduit in or not to be able to install the lights at a later date or not is an open question. But for safety and security, and for, people are going to be walking their dogs over there from all these buildings anyway, whether there's lights in there or not. So you might as well provide them a safe, secure location.
So the notion that, the sign says parks closed at dark is not quite the case. I mean,
No, but we have tennis courts with lights on them, and the parks say they're closed at dark. So, we're inviting them in there even though it's closed at dark.
just wanted to, truth in advertising, just.
Yep.
I think that's fine.
I think the parks for the active use are closed at dark, and then to walk through is certainly a not a bad idea, especially in this park, as Charlie talked about earlier, the urban setting. It really leads you right up to a Harris Teeter that's open 24 hours a day.
Right.
It is 20, yeah. So
Passing through is considered a permitted use.
yeah, and we're not talking about lighting it up like a ball field either. These would be low lights that kind of get you through in a safe
That was my
manner.
next question.
Especially with the neighborhood,
I
they'd be low.
assume that the neighbors have bought into whatever lighting plan that you are laying out, and it'll be low impact and dark skies and all that stuff.
Yes.
Okay. So we have $1 million in money from the West Broad project, is that right?
That's correct.
So if we do the stormwater work that needs to be done, are we pretty sure that, given that we are dealing with another low-lying area like Lincoln Park and others, it's going to solve the boggy, soggy problem?
Yeah, because right now, we have water draining from the Bowl of America roof. It flows down like a river over that asphalt trail that connects Bowl of America to Big Chimneys. So we'd be picking up the water that's flowing there. Also, from all the backyards in Winter Hill, the water kind of flows down there and through the park. So we have inlets located at different areas of the park to pick up that water that's flowing into the park from other areas, as well as from upstream to collect it and reduce that sogginess.
Okay.
Literally carrying it off of the property into a proper storm drain, so there's no bog possible at that point, excuse me.
Okay. My last question is, as you said, this was to be, a jewel in the City Center South crown back when we were talking about doing City Center South, which never happened. Is there anything that we would do here if we pursued the full project that would in any way impinge or restrict our ability to do significant commercial redevelopment in this area along the lines of what was contemplated with City Center South?
I don't believe so. The only thing that, from my recollection of that time that we discussed, that's not being done here, would be a festival-style street as between the project. As Shirley Street got extended, you'd have a festival-style street. By that I mean no curbs, so you'd be able to close the street and have free access. That's not going to be impeded by this. That would be the only thing I can think of from what we contemplated when, you know, we were trying to figure out how we could design this park in light of the City Center South.
Okay.
And I do think that festival-style street could still be added in later if indeed the developer came along and got that bowling alley site right next to
We're not putting
it.
any curb and gutter along that line that you'd have to take out.
So there'd still be an opportunity for developer applicant proffers to do other improvements beyond the scope of what we were talking about here tonight.
Absolutely. The entrance feature, as you see, is much smaller. That could be redone. What I would say is if you had more money to put in there, what is missing from this project because of being value engineered is seating. Some of the seating's being taken out. I think knee walls adjacent to the path give people places to sit, eat their lunch, to hang out. We talked previously about some type of a little amphitheater in there for people to sit, to have small performances. That's wasn't included. So there are many ideas, if funds become available, that this park could be enhanced even with this design.
Okay. All right, I'm holding my conclusions for later on. I'd like to hear what everybody else asks and thinks.
Vice Mayor Conley?
So I was at one time on the Recreation and Parks Committee about 2 years ago, and this was a hot topic back then, and I sat through a number of those community engagement meetings, and I think the child who drew the swings is probably ready to push someone else on the swings at this point, right?
She has a child who's 2, just like the people who were waiting for our skating equipment at West End Park have now graduated from college.
Right. Luckily, there's always new people that want to use our parks and our skateboards. So the latest design, the 60% design that you've done, if we do this design,
That's a draft.
that's a draft
Yeah.
of that design. So that basically doesn't touch, as you said, the Annandale Road side of the park.
Correct.
The grant that you were talking about, the 2020 traffic grant,
Yes.
that handles the crosswalk
Yes, the
and
cross.
the traffic calming.
Right, and the traffic calming, as we were originally envisioning, it was bumping the curb line out in Annandale Road and putting street trees and getting that full kind of streetscape that we
Right.
like to have along Broad Street. So that was what
Right.
was envisioned as the traffic calming for that.
But that kind of grant would not affect the berm. The berm would still stay.
We would have to find other funding
There'd
for that.
So we would need additional funding
To
if
build
we
that
wanted
plaza
to do
area and
this
cut down the
part,
berm.
and then the road part, and then part 3 would be
Correct.
doing this part, getting rid of the berm, changing the entrance.
Yes.
So is there a way to phase it, which I know in the long run would cost a lot more money?
The way I've had the architect put it together here was that we're tying into the existing asphalt path up at the top right.
Right.
So we're not really putting anything in that we'd have to take out later. We're just kind of leaving it. So that makes it easier. We're not wasting money kind of building infrastructure that we're going to tear out at a later date.
Okay.
I think what you'd want to do is try to time both of those traffic calming and the entrance area improvements at the same time, because that's a bit more challenging because you're working with the sidewalks and how the sidewalks tie into that plaza area.
Okay.
You'd want to do those at the same time.
Okay. So then what you're asking tonight is an extra $350,000 to do this part?
No.
No.
That was
This
my
is-
attempt to bring it within budget.
Oh,
That
I
is
see, I see. Okay.
That's what we need another $350,000 for.
For that one.
Correct.
And to do this one, this remains within budget with then an estimated unknown additional to finish the
Right.
Yeah, so if I could,
Okay.
the way I look at it is the park is one project. All the traffic calming is a separate transportation project. So if you were to turn it into two pieces, I would call it phase 1 and phase 2 of the park project.
okay.
And then all the other traffic calming pieces would come with the grant money that's coming in 2020. And so if we got the $350,000 showed up today, we would do what is the 60% design after the first round of value engineering, and all of that at this point could get done according to and already quoted by a construction company. So I think we could actually say right now that we can get that done with the amount of money we have left.
Okay. And so then this 60%, that does change the berm and the entrance.
That cuts down the
Okay.
berm.
Okay. And then Ms. Mister, you just mentioned, or maybe you did, Ms. Callahan, the water coming off of the top of Bowl America.
Yes.
Do they bear any responsibility for that water, or are they just shooting that water into our park
Well,
and we're paying
well,
for it?
no, it's coming off the roof and it's going
Yeah.
onto their property, but their property flows onto the park property.
Okay.
So,
So there's no way to hold them accountable
not
for
unless
it.
they redevelop.
Okay. Which would have been city
Yeah.
center, that didn't happen. All right, thank you.
All right, other comments, questions? Mr. Lichtenhouse?
I mean, it's on. Thanks. So you provided some explanation as to the asphalt versus brick, concrete. Okay. Is having asphalt, is that what gets it into ADA compliance? So are you required to have a solid surface for ADA compliance on that part?
Well, the ADA compliance, I think, is what Kim was talking about is getting it from Winter Hill where there's a different grade into it, and that's the ADA compliance. Asphalt or concrete is ADA compliant, either one of them
Okay.
will work.
Okay. Why wouldn't we just use crushed gravel like we did in Herman Park?
Different, in my mind, different feel,
Okay.
different usage. We have to constantly go in and replace the crushed, not constantly, but we have to go in and replace the crushed gravel on occasion. And you're going to get a different style of use in this park, I would expect. And I don't think in an urban park setting you're going to want to have crushed gravel aesthetically. I don't see that. Howard E. Herman is
It's a trail.
Stream Valley Park. It's a trail, and it fits in with that aesthetically.
Okay. What percentage of the overall cost is associated with the equipment and the structures, or dollar amount? I mean, if you've got $1.35 million hardscape versus fixtures, what's that amount?
So the play equipment is about $200,000. A pavilion itself, not including the slab on grade, is about $40,000. And that's like the one at Madison Park. That's what we're looking at for about $40,000. Then you're looking at maybe another 12 for the slab for that. But benches are about $3,000 a piece. So the more benches you add, the more it's going to add up. But right now we were considering, I think, a bench at the Shirley Street entrance, and then 3 along the Annandale Road Plaza area. As far as seating, the other seating is taken care of via a concrete wall between the larger kids' play area and the swing area. I don't know if you can kind of see the dark circle right here. That's a whole seat wall between the two areas. So you get more seating for your money that way. And then the same with the small kids' play area, and you've got a seat wall there. But the biggest chunk is the play equipment, which is around $200,000.
So I mean, this is effectively a complete use change from what it's used for now, which has been a throughway. I mean, that's been my experience. I mean, you're looking for people to come, stay, play, have events, because that's a ton of hardscape that you guys have. I mean, that's the intent.
Correct. It's not really an extensive use because there's play equipment in there now. It's expanding the play equipment. And the play equipment going in is consistent with the amounts we've used on the last 2 redevelopments. Lincoln was about 180, Cherry Hill was about 200. So the cost for the play equipment going in is consistent with what we've done in other parks. We're not creating a Taj Mahal.
Oh, sure.
Where's that?
No, I'm just trying to get an
And the amount of
understanding
equipment that's in there now would not be greatly increased by this. It will be increased a bit, but it doesn't really change the look of that park as it is now on the play equipment side of things.
Okay. I mean, the challenge here in looking at costs, and we've talked about this as it relates to the library renovation project. I mean, we are just at an all-time high in terms of construction costs. I mean, labor, materials, especially anything related to hardscape, playground equipment as a whole. That was a tough lesson to learn when you approve budgets for elementary schools. The amount of playground equipment, it makes me question my employment choices, how much they've been able to charge for that. So I get that. So the challenge is the overall cost, thinking of what it would have cost back in 2007 when this was originally conceived, as opposed to talking about in 2018, so I'm sensitive to that. Just a couple other questions. So looking at the pavilion, this was just a broader question that came up in some other conversations. When I think about the use of our parks, and this question came up as it relates to that, I'll call it a pocket park over there off of Broad Street on the retail side that the EDA was looking at redeveloping. How are parks used in terms of enforcement related to smoking and things like that? How do we enforce that as we think about renovating parks, adding structures with covered pavilions?
Are you familiar with the Dillon Rule?
I am familiar with the Dillon Rule.
We cannot do anything that the Commonwealth does not allow us to do. Commonwealth does not allow us to limit smoking in anything other than buildings.
Yep.
We have requested for at least the last 2 years, and maybe even more than that, that be included in the package that goes down to the legislature, which has been done. It's a Commonwealth that was raised on tobacco, so it's hard. We have started a voluntary education process for the citizens with regards to smoking in our park. If you go by our kiosks, you'll see various signs that were been created by our youth student representatives that say, young lungs at work, please don't smoke. Their trash cans now have signs on them asking them not to smoke. The city does not have the power to prohibit smoking in the parks, but we are trying to do it voluntarily.
So I understand the Dillon Rule, and I'm aware of that, but we have fixed structures that could be used for city use or rented, just like we would any other facility, even though it doesn't have 4 walls on it. I would imagine that falls in our purview, that we have the ability to enforce that, at least in terms of city events. Am I wrong on that, Carol?
Yeah, it really, the Virginia Carol microphone. The Virginia Indoor Clean Air Act is the only authority we have in that area, and so it is only within buildings that are enclosed.
Okay.
So we cannot prohibit smoking in parks outside.
Okay. All right. Just in terms of signage to discourage people from doing that, what are we doing with that? I mean, you mentioned a volunteer effort. I mean, I frankly have seen, maybe I just haven't been looking, but haven't seen signage or a whole lot of efforts.
We're in the process of dealing with communications to enlarge it. This is just something we've been working on for the last year and a half as to how to implement it. You look at Arlington. Arlington has permanent signs that are on there asking you not to smoke. We haven't gotten to that stage yet. We're trying to do it at a groundswell. Our student reps are hopefully going to put a letter to the editor and communicate. Then we're working with communications to highlight both on their Instagram account and their social media the movement to hopefully limit smoking in the parks. But that is on our agenda. We talk about it every month on how to work that in within the parameters of what we're providing.
Yeah. I think it's important just.
But we also just as a thing part, we also don't want to pollute our parks with signs. So it's it's a fine line as to where we're putting these things. We have kiosks that we use, and we're putting them there. We're putting them on trash cans, but we're cognizant that we don't want too much signage in our parks. But we think this is important, and we're working on it, and we're going to continue as it comes up legislatively to request the city to work on that so we can ban smoking in the park. That's one of the things I personally would love to see.
Yeah. If it obviously can't be legally enforced based on your comments, Carol, I think it's important for signage to be prominently placed. I mean, I've personally found that we've got certain covered areas in parks that effectively become unusable in some cases if people are camping out smoking. Not that people can't exercise their free right, just not in a place that you're looking to plan for extensive use and play and stay. To put an additional $200,000 dollars worth of playground equipment in a place that's going to have a pavilion where kids are going to want to have birthday parties and not at least try to discourage that, I think would be a bit short-sighted.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, other comments, keeping in mind, we do have 5 more items tonight, so
Thank you for the time.
this conversation may not get totally resolved tonight.
Well,
Mr.
you know,
Z.
we could probably talk about a park all night long here because that's the thing people are most familiar with. But thank you, Mayor. It's clear from the designs that we're looking at tonight, from the one in 17 and 18, 60%, that when you embark on a discussion with potential users and with the Recs and Parks Board, that the play equipment seems to be the one thing that has kept to its true course. It still looks the same, hasn't really changed, and whereas everything else has. So I imagine that somewhere in here you probably asked the neighborhood what things, if we had to cut out, would they say would be in order of preference. So I imagine that the gazebo went first, pavilion, in discussions with the neighborhood. The lighting, I don't know whether, I would have thought that they would have been more vocal about keeping the lighting.
They were, but it's $100,000, so we could either cut out the lighting or you could cut out some of the play equipment, and if that was a choice,
Right.
it was the lighting.
Right, the lighting. So I don't, do we have any statistics on what, hesitate to even say crime rate, but have there been incidents in the park and in the adjoining neighborhood over the time period that we've studied this for well, maybe as long as you've been on the board, Charlie?
I am not aware of any.
So we really haven't had any incidents, but this is a precautionary effort, and so I guess someone else, who was it, Mary Beth, that asked what would be the impact of doing some of this now and some of it later, and you alluded to perhaps conduits, things that you don't want to dig up the ground again unless you have to. So how much would it be just for the conduits?
That, I do not have the answer, but it's relatively inexpensive if you're already digging up the ground and just throwing some
I would think so.
conduit
You're
in
just
with
running
trace
some
tape.
plastic piping with junction boxes, waterproof junction boxes. I'm looking at all the things that cost money here, and even if we said, okay, you need to just carefully proceed to the end of this, you think about the concrete, the electronics and the lighting, the aluminum and the bollards, the steel and the concrete itself, the steel in the pavilion potentially, it's all going to be impacted by the tariffs that are among us. So it's, I wouldn't be surprised to see your costs escalating, even cutting out most of this design here. I'm also mindful that we have in front of us some huge projects to try to finish off, and none of them are immune from the effects of tariffs and the market. Certainly no one can predict those construction costs as well. So let me be the first here to say that I would like to see a careful, reasoned approach to this, one that lays down the conduit for lighting. It looks like you have about 15 or so lights. Can't really
There's
count.
about 7 or 8 lights. There was not.
Oh, I must have been looking at the wrong version here.
Yeah, that was
The
the
original
version.
version. Quite a few, so, all right. Then maybe we could do something with the CIP in time to build out the rest. Having said that, macadam asphalt can be a pretty attractive kind of stuff. In Hyde Park in London, for example, the original macadam, the final roll of the aggregate is light-colored brown, very small rocks, and that wears forever and looks nice. People walk on it, so it's something to consider if you had to do asphalt as opposed to concrete. Thank you.
Other comments or questions? Okay, I'm not sure we're going to get to the bottom of this tonight.
Can I make one follow-up on the staging process of it? I'm not an engineer, but you have a significant berm up at the top, and I don't know where you're going to, how much dirt you're going to need at the bottom. but you may want to be looking into that as to whether, because I mean, the largest costs, one of the large costs of development is either bringing dirt in or removing dirt. And if you have the ability on this project to spread the dirt around and avoid that, I would assume there's significant cost savings. And also, when you're mobilized on site to do one project, as opposed to mobilizing a second time, you're going to have a significant cost by doing it in more than one stages. But then again, I know money's tight, but that's a thought to be considered.
Mr. Mayor, could I ask a question about timing?
Sure, and then let's try to wrap up this conversation.
Okay. I mean, the market's been a little soft this week, but I'm still persuaded that this economic cycle still has some legs in it, and therefore that plus what Mr. Z was talking about on the tariff front suggests that things are not going to get cheaper the longer we talk about this. My thinking on this, and the question to staff is, you know, the West Broad development was a big development, controversial. Some folks who lived in the neighborhood were for it, some were not for it. But my impression now that it's in place is that it's pretty popular, pretty successful. It is impactful to that neighborhood, and I'm mindful of that. You know, we've been very successful in getting more feet on the street with our mixed-use developments, but there is a cost associated with that we have to be willing to bear too, I think. Cost in, you know, better streetscape, better parks. This project, in my opinion, falls into that category. I think after having heard what I've heard tonight that I would be supportive of if Ms. Hardy, the Rec and Parks liaison, proposed a $1.35 million budget for this project. I'd be inclined to support that and would like to do it sooner rather than later, because I'm pretty confident that even that $1.35 million is going to come up a little short on some of these things we're talking here tonight if we keep talking more and more about it.
It just went up $5 while you were talking, but that's okay.
I did want to clarify one thing. The trails in here right now are currently priced as asphalt. So if we wanted to go to concrete, that would be an additional cost to that $350,000, just to make sure everybody was aware.
Okay. I tell you, again, given our schedule and the things we have to do tonight, I'm not sure this conversation is going to get resolved right now, but I thank you all for coming out and the great work you've done, and we certainly want to continue this conversation and get this resolved as soon as possible.
Generally, when you refer something to us, you give us a deadline. Can we give you a deadline? I'm kidding, I'm kidding.
Yeah, okay. But again, thank you for the great work you guys do. We really appreciate it. All right, let's move on to our next item, the purchasing resolution. Mr. Shields?
Mr. Wise is going to give our presentation on this. And I would just note at the beginning that what Mr. Wise is bringing forward is an opportunity for the council by resolution to set forth the city's procurement rules. We have always followed the state code, and the council rules really just related to what comes to council for approval and what doesn't. This gives us sort of a more a fulsome approach in terms of what our policies are, and it also allows us to take advantage of some amounts of flexibility that we can take advantage of in order to make sure we maintain transparency, maintain fairness, and maintain competitiveness in our procurement, but also to do so in the most effective and efficient manner. So with that intro, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Wise.
Well said.
Okay. Start over. Thank you for having us here tonight, and good evening to everyone. Well said, Wyatt. Thank you for that. So everyone here, I'm sure, is familiar with the Virginia Public Procurement Act, which lays down the rules and regulations that local jurisdictions within the Commonwealth must adhere to in their procurement activities. One of the things that the VPPA also does is it allows local jurisdictions who enact their own policies and procedures and adopt them by resolution to take advantage of certain exemptions within the VPPA. a small municipality like Falls Church can definitely benefit from that opportunity, which is why we're before you tonight. So what you have before you in the purchasing resolution is a foundational document that will allow us to adopt policies and procedures in adherence with the VPPA, but enable to take advantage of some of these exemptions. That will also generate a procurement manual that our staff will be able to use, which will be of great benefit to me. It'll reduce the number of phone calls that I get. But for instance, one of the exemptions, and probably the one that we are most interested in, is that currently, for construction, local jurisdictions are not able to use cooperative contracts unless they are installing a synthetic or turf track, and we don't do that very often. There is an exemption available to us that would enable us to use cooperative construction contracts for projects that are up to $1 million per fiscal year. There are a number of opportunities within the city currently and in the future where that would be of great advantage to us. It would prevent us from having to go out on a formal solicitation, which is anywhere from 2 to 6 months. We would be able to jump on a contract right away, fulfill the requirements sooner, be efficient and expedient, and solve whatever issue we are facing at that time much faster. So job order contracts, task order contracts that are construction oriented would fall into that area. So that's essentially what we're looking at here, is a way for the city to be more efficient in its procurement activities, to lessen staff's workload and get our requirements satisfied in a faster, more expedient fashion.
All right, City Attorney, do you have anything to add to this?
I don't really, but I think that, I know we had a similar purchasing regulations in Arlington. We had adopted alternative procedures, and as long as they have competitive principles, there's a number of places in which you get some flexibility. There are some provisions in the state code that are mandatory, and those have been included within this document, but I think it can benefit the city and enable us to adapt our purchasing rules to better fit our needs in particular.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Z.
Thank you, Mayor. I heard about this, not this change, but the use of cooperative construction agreements about a year ago, and so I looked into it a little bit further as it would apply for things like site work, flat work, things like that. So there would be, I think, sufficient capacity in the contracts that are extant in the agreements that we could basically hook onto those and make them sort of like large-scale blanket purchase orders. And you've looked into that, and you're pretty clear that there is sufficient capacity in
Yes.
those contracts
Yes.
in our area?
There are a couple of contracts that we are aware of that we have not been able to take advantage of because we don't have an existing purchasing resolution. They're not all local jurisdictions. Some of them are from organizations such as U.S. Communities. But without this resolution and the policies that would then be generated by it, we can't take that route. So we have to go out on a formal solicitation and award a contract, and it's just a time-consuming process.
Yeah, I get that. And so these receiving activities would also, you've talked to them, and they would welcome our participation? as
Yes,
it were?
yes.
Well, I think it's a good thing to do.
All right, Ms. Hardy.
Thank you. So generally, I agree that seems like a good thing to be able to be more nimble and maintain competitiveness. Are there any downsides?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know if our council knows of any. But she mentioned a couple of things that I probably should have, but they're in the staff report. The fact that when we take this step with our policies, we still have to be mindful of the VPPA and competitive requirements and whatnot, and we will certainly do that. We will be good stewards of appropriated funds and very careful in how we go about our procurement process. And do you know of any possible downside to this?
The only thing I could think of is it's something that we do have to keep an eye on annually. If there are mandatory changes to the state code, we may need to adjust our purchasing resolution. But many jurisdictions use this. I know we had one in Arlington annually. There'd be a little tune-up with changes, sometimes things that came out of state code changes, sometimes things that we had just discovered that we thought we could make better. But that's the only thing I can think of that really is difficult, because to the extent there are provisions in the Procurement Act that we would want to take advantage of, we can simply add them into our purchasing resolution.
Got it. And so if we approve this and vote for it next week, is it effective immediately?
I hope so.
Okay.
That was my thinking. And just to follow on what Carol just said, those changes that are enacted to the VPPA every year, we have to be mindful of those anyway. In this instance, they may be changes that we would then need to take some formal action to incorporate into our policies. We don't have that now, but we still have to know about those changes and take them into account. Carol comes from Arlington. She keeps referring to that. I come from Fairfax County, where they have a massive purchasing resolution. And when I was there, that's what we referred to as our Bible. So,
Got it. Got it. There's some a bunch of parking ideas that I think the task force has come up with, and I think we'd love to be able to use this as soon as possible just to get some of those things done.
That's exactly right.
Thank you.
So how would it work? So we're writing someone else's contracts, that's essentially what we're doing. But how do you get a kind of a competitive price if you're not bidding it out? In other words, is it based on a unit price, or
Well,
how
it's
is
already
it?
been done by the awarding agency. They've already gone through. We can't write any contract that hasn't been awarded through a formal competitive process. That's our current situation now. That's the way it is. It won't change in any way. What this will enable us to do is use contracts in areas that the VPPA prevents, construction being the biggest and the most important to us. So when those contracts are awarded, the agency that awarded them has worked towards getting the best possible price. Sometimes there are unit costs that you can negotiate further. Usually you are tied to whatever the awarding agency agreed on. There's matters of scale involved there, and Falls Church, of course, being one of the smaller municipalities around, can take advantage of that as well.
Yeah, but so if you write a contract and we've got, some work at a park or something like that we want to do, I mean, the only way it seems to me you could write it directly is if you have a per unit price, like per square foot for doing something, or per linear foot. How do we want that berm taken out? How do we ride someone's contract about getting the berm in the park taken out?
Most of them would have that kind of pricing, but there's all kinds of contracts out there, so it's hard to sit here and cover all the possible examples that might be available.
But just give me
to us.
one example, because I'm not sure like, for example, if we wanted to get the berm taken out, we wouldn't be able to ride someone's contract for that, or we would be able to?
We would be able to, assuming they had a fee structure that accommodated that. And I'm not an engineer. I can't talk about what kind of specifications would be required for that. But we rely on our Public Works Department to bring in that expertise.
Not to be argumentative, but just so, like whoever we're dealing with, they must have some per unit price or something about moving dirt from here to there, and it'll be based on how many cubic yards of dirt we're moving or something like that?
Yeah, something like that. Some volume, I would think, or whatever that their price would be based on. So,
Mr. Snyder?
So let me try to move this from hypothetical to real. We just heard a presentation on a park that we all want to do, but there's an overrun. So if we adopted this, and this is some homework to do, what competitive contracts could we ride on to give us the kind of park we want and reduce our costs? So that would make a great sort of real live instance. So I would be interested, and again, I don't expect an answer tonight,
right.
But I would like a real world example of how this will actually serve to save money, to give an additional incentive to do it. The theory sounds good, I appreciate it, but it would be nice to apply it to something, and I just heard a presentation on a project that might be a good one for that.
I understand.
Would you mind doing that, Mr. City Manager? Would that be, would you be agreeable to that?
Yeah, I think we could get back to you on how it would be applied to like a park project like this. And I think that probably would be a complex question, but when you were getting the cost estimates, all those were based on per unit costs. And so the question would be, is there a contract out there that has those similar per units that we could ride? So then the policy question is whether this is going to be a policy that would cover construction projects under $1.35 million or $1 million. I'm sorry, I'll leave that aside.
Well, you see where I'm going. If not this, then another project. I'd like to test run it before we approve it to see. Let's have a real world example of how this is going to actually perform.
And probably where it most often is going to apply or be for like sidewalk projects or striping projects or paving projects. Those are real easy to break out on a per unit cost, and that's how they're bid anyway. Something that is more creative, where there's a design, it would be a more complex process, but I think it's still feasible.
Yeah, that would be great if we could do it in connection with this moving forward. It'd be very helpful. Thank you.
You might find it interesting to know that when I came in tonight and saw Kim, she said, "Why are you here?" And I told her, and she lit up. So she sees a lot of opportunity in the project she's working with. So.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Lichtenhouse, then Vice Mayor Connolly.
Thanks. So just I'm clear on this. So the contracts that are out there that have been pre-bid, pre-negotiated, if we're to ride those contracts, we're restricted to the individuals that bid on those contracts that we're riding?
To the companies they were awarded to,
Mhm.
yes.
Okay, so we're restricted, once we decide to attach ourselves to a contract, we've eliminated a pool of potential folks that we could negotiate with?
Well, what we would do is we would review contracts that are available that address the requirement that we have. There may be one, there may be 10 different jurisdictions. There may be a jurisdiction that has a multiple award contract where we could request quotes from the various awardees for whatever our particular requirement was. So,
But we're still limited to those individuals that were involved with that contract. When I
Correct.
say individuals, meaning folks that we could potentially hire.
right, they have to be the recipient of an award from some jurisdiction or organization that does cooperative agreements for us to be able to use it.
Okay. I guess my biggest concern with this is that once you put something like this into motion, you almost become dependent upon it and use it as a crutch to help execute some of these smaller contracts, and maybe we lose sight of competitiveness or a better fit for some of the projects that we as a city want. So I kind of with Mr. Snyder here in terms of a test run and understanding a practical application, because once you put something like this in motion, we don't want to look back in 3 years and realize that we may not have gotten the best deal that we could.
Well, I like to think that we in finance and procurement are very mindful of our roles as being stewards of the appropriated funds that we have available to us. Not enough, of course, we all are aware of that, but we're careful about that. What this will help us do is address requirements faster than we can in some instances now. A formal solicitation takes a while. Even a short one is generally about 2 months, and many of them can run longer than that. And we have a small staff. I'm the only procurement professional in the city, so it would be a boon to us, I think, to have this capability to, and we wouldn't use it just across the board all the time. I understand your concern that we might look at it as a potential crutch, but as I said, I'm mindful of that, and I don't see that happening. I'll do my best to keep it from happening, and we'll try to make it work to give the city best value and do what's right for our
That comment was not an
constituents.
indictment on you. I trust you guys. It's all the other people that I don't trust. So that was the point.
Appreciate
Vice
that.
Mayor Connolly.
Mine is kind of a follow-on to what Mr. Lichtenhouse said. Basically, if we adopt this, that doesn't mean we have to use it every time.
Oh, we don't have to use it at all if we adopt it.
It's just another tool in the toolkit.
Exactly.
And are there other, this is for construction, currently are there contracts that we do ride with other jurisdictions?
Oh, we write a
already?
lot
Right.
of contracts. Fairfax is a great friend of ours in that
Right.
respect. They are the big dog in Virginia, of course, and we take advantage of contracts they have in place that are good value for what we want to do. And there are a couple instances where they write our contracts, for that matter, but they have a much bigger procurement office than we do, and they can get deals that we can't get, basically.
So can you just give us a real-world example of a couple of the contracts that we do ride?
That we do.
Are existing right now?
Elevator maintenance and repair. We have so many of them, so when you ask me, it's hard to come up with a specific example, but fuel purchasing, yes. Road salt, which just went up in price. Library books. There's a laundry list of contracts that we do ride.
And we've been, obviously,
And,
that's a
and
good
have,
practice
and have been
and
doing,
has
and a
been
lot of these
successful for us.
I inherited. They were already in place when I came on board a couple of years ago. But we are always looking out for opportunities in that respect before we go to the trouble of putting together a formal solicitation and putting it out on the street. We look to see if there's an existing agreement that satisfies our needs matches our budget. And one of the things that we do in those instances, of course, is talk to the awarding agencies that use the awardee and find out if they've been happy with the work. So we always check the references.
That's good. And you would follow that same procedure?
Yes. Oh, yes.
With construction, is check
Right.
the references and make sure we want to ride it.
None of that will change. This will just give us more options than we currently have.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you for your fine work here at the city. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Shields, let's move on to the next item, the Arts and Humanities
As
Grants. Review.
Jim is moving away, can we just brag on him just a little bit? It is a one-person shop, and we do have Faye who helps, who's retired from the city, but we've never really let her fully retire, but she's, but this has been a year where we've procured a $120 million high school, which Jim has overseen that process, and taking 10 acres of property to market. Jim has overseen that process, along with all the normal business. So hopefully we're giving you interesting work, but but Jim always does it with great professionalism, a good sense of humor, and he's always looking out for the city's best interest. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Next item, Mr. Shields, the Arts and Humanities Grants.
So Corey Janicelli is coming forward to give us a briefing on the proposed FY19 allocation of $45,000 worth of grant awards for the arts community. And we have a competitive process where these are all considered with the citizen board, and these are the recommendations.
Thank you. So I'm happy to be here today to recommend the FY19 Arts and Humanities Grants recommendations. Just as a kind of overview, the grant funds are awarded to support projects and organizations that achieve one or more of the following goals. So they want to stimulate the excellence in the City of Falls Church in the area of arts, theater, culture, and or history, to encourage cultural and ethnic diversity in the City of Falls Church, and enhancing the quality of life in the City of Falls Church through stimulating economic development, supporting educational advancements in the arts, theater, culture, and or history, appealing to the widest audience, and making culture, arts, theater, and history accessible to all. The grant applications submitted are reviewed by city staff to make sure they meet the grant guidelines and that all additional documentation has been submitted. Applications are then sent to the Grant Review Committee for scoring and recommendations. Applications are scored on appropriateness, merit, financial need, organizational capacity, and service to the community. These recommendations are now presented to Council for consideration. Once the grants are awarded, the Recreation and Parks Department provides grant management and quality assurance. This grants process affords local applicants clarity through a well-formulated system and easily referenced list of grant guidelines, and results of the grants program is more opportunities for city residents to participate in quality arts and cultural opportunities locally. So impact, the FY19 budget, City Council appropriated $45,000 to the Arts and Humanities Grants Program, of which $20,000 was designated for project grants and $25,000 designated for operations grants, and so there's no additional fiscal impact at this time. The submission of the VCA Local Government Challenge Grant leverages additional funding of $4,500, increasing the city's total resources to $49,500. So just a very quick summary of the FY19 grant applications. All project and operational proposals are recommended for a grant award this year. All applications met grant guidelines and are consistent with the Arts and Humanities Grants Program goals. So for project grants, this year we had 5 project grants proposed with a total of $22,000 in requested funding, and the city budgeted $20,000 for these grants and plan to apply for additional $4,500 from the VCA grant, bringing the total to $24,500. And the Grant Review Committee recommended full funding of all project grants this year. In terms of the operational grant submissions, this year we had 5 operational proposals submitted with a combined total of $47,500, and the city budgeted $25,000 for these grants. The Grants Review Committee recommended grants awards to all 5 operational grant proposals with a combined total of $25,000 based on the original guidelines. Due to significant increase in operational funding requests, staff is recommending that council allow the $3,000 of allocated project grant funding to be used towards operational grant funding this year. And the staff recommends splitting the $3,000 in project grant funding evenly across the 4 organizations requesting operational funding that did not receive full funding from the Grant Review Committee. And I have, in your packets, the full funding recommendations can be found in attachment A and B. So with that quick overview, I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. I know a lot of hard work went into getting us where we are today, so thank you very much. Mr. Shields, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I do want council just to be aware of an issue I know that some of you all possibly been contacted on, and that is the funding for Creative Cauldron. And when the council created the operating funding amount, there was sort of a new component to the grants. That was done after having received a request for help for Creative Cauldron to pay its property taxes at the theater. And so that request was made, rather than give a grant directly to Creative Cauldron in the amount that they needed as sort of an allocated grant. Instead, the council set aside funds for operations that people could apply for on a competitive basis. So just, I think it's for the council's awareness, the operation grant does not fully cover the Creative Cauldron property tax that they will owe as part of their CAM charges in their current location. And so there's a member of the community has contacted some of you all to raise that as a concern. I just wanted to note that, and we're happy to discuss that. But I think that is something I think the council should be aware of. I don't know the details in terms of what the request, I think the request is shown here on the form, but there is I guess what the delta is. I'm not conversant with those numbers, but Ms. Janicelli, if you are.
The total amount requested by Creative Cauldron this year was $15,000. I believe that their taxes this year is $13,000.
Yeah, I thought the deficit may be 3,000 from last year and then 3 from this year for a total of 6, but I could be mistaken. What's that?
That's what I heard as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'd like to get some resolution on that before we finalize this. I don't know if staff can take a second bite at this apple or take a look and try to resolve this prior to our next council meeting or the regular council meeting. But I think it's important to try to get that squared away if we can. I don't know if Vice Mayor Conley had some involvement with this as well.
I think that's a good idea. First, I want to thank Ms. Janicelli for organizing this so well and tracking it and making sure that all the paperwork is turned in on time so that we really have a true grant program. And you've really raised the bar on that one, so thank you for that. You've done a really nice job. As far as in addition to those Creative Cauldron problems, they've also run into some other financial problems with donors and grants that they have received from Fairfax County that are changing as well. And so I'm just wondering if we need to look at the pie a little differently. And I don't know how we do that because you're recommending $28,000 now to spend by moving the $3,000 over from, so there's $28,000 and $47,000 worth of requests. So it's a hard thing to crack. But I'm wondering if before we approve it in the next week, we can either talk to some of the other grantees or talk to Creative Cauldron and see if we can come up with some tighter numbers that everybody could work together on. I don't know.
So first correction, it's the reallocation is $2,500. I did write that down wrong. So it's $2,500 that all of that was left over once all of the awards for the project grants that we'd like to reallocate towards operational grants.
And that's reflected in attachment B?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, please.
In terms of trying to support Creative Cauldron more, there's certainly different ways that the grant, how the grant program is right now, all for operational grants, any organization is able to submit a request up to $15,000. Of course, they have to show financial need. Different counties do have a different kind of setup for, so some do a percent of the organization's budget that can give a little bit more to larger organizations in terms of percent of, but we have so many small organizations, so that would hurt the smaller organizations that also need funding. So there's, a challenge of, do you still want it to be a competitive grant program, or are you looking for a way to find funding for Creative Cauldron?
Yeah, I'm sure there's not a simple answer necessarily out there, but I think for some of us at least, this is the first we've heard of this issue this afternoon. And so I for one, would like to just get this fleshed out a little bit more and see if we can come up to a resolution that addresses more fully, if not totally, their stated needs. And so I'm hoping maybe in the coming days before we meet again next week that we could kind of regroup on this issue and reach out to Creative Cauldron and maybe some of these other groups as well to see if there's something that can be resolved to try to better address some of the needs that have been spoken of.
And also, I don't know, I know that Arts Fairfax, someone mentioned, is they're no longer going to be able to fund City of Falls Church organizations starting in FY20. So it's definitely, we want to try to support Creative Cauldron in thinking about getting their funding for the future year. But it doesn't, they did receive funding from Arts Fairfax for FY19.
And $25,000, I seem to recall. Was that the number?
I think it was 22. Oh.
Thereabouts. Yeah.
Are there any other groups?
Are there other groups in Falls River City that are affected by that change in the
Not that I
policy?
know of. When I spoke to Arts Fairfax, they only spoke to us about Creative Cauldron. Most of our other organizations, I think, are their program is so big that our organizations might be a little bit too small to apply to some of the Arts Fairfax program project or operational grants. But Arts Fairfax does still want to support the City of Falls Church through their educational programs, and we support by offering to allow the organizations to post their events on their website to help with publicity of their events. So it's just the funding aspect of the organization.
Could I ask a question?
Of course.
Thank you. You referred earlier to organizational capacity as one of the metrics that enables us to decide who and how much to fund. It strikes me that these groups, are creating events that are really the glue that, holds the city together. Almost every month we have some special event, whether it's Tenor Hill or Women's March or all the other good things that we do. And yet, oftentimes, my impression is that but for a small handful of people, maybe even sometimes only just one person, these events would not happen, or at least would not happen on the scale that they happen now. In your capacity now that you dig into their proposals and know about their operational capacity, are we like creating a cookbook or a notebook of here are the 300 things that we have to do to get the Tenor Hill Festival off the ground, or to make Watch Night happen, or whatever it is, so that we can give to the next people who are running these races some information that gets them further down the road than sometimes I'm afraid we are right now, because we're so reliant on what's in one or two people's heads.
Yeah, I don't know if that shows in the applications, but I know that the organizations themselves would be happy to share that with anyone that's interested.
And I would just add that on any of them where the city is more of a co-sponsor, because we're partnering like Tinner Hill or Watch Night. There's playbooks in Rexham Park Special Events Office on how to set up all those. So there's very structured there. And through the work with Corey, they're very structured on the budgeting and the accounting piece. But that larger picture of ensuring sustainability of the different nonprofits and stuff hopefully has some support through the Humanities Council working together. But it is their individual responsibility as a nonprofit to sustain that.
Okay, that's good. Good there's a playbook, particularly with Chris taking off and others taking up where he left off. The only other thought I have is just, what is our auditing capacity for making sure that when money goes to these groups, it actually gets spent on the things that relate to the request.
It's a reimbursement grant, so they have to submit receipts before they receive their funding. So they put out their own money and then receive reimbursement for that.
Okay, and it's our experience in the past that the receipts that we've received have matched up with the monies that we've dispersed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks.
Ms. Hardy?
Thank you, Corey. I just had a more general question. So I was looking through the recipients from this year's operating and project monies, and I looked through last year's and previous years, and it's really the same handful of organizations. Are we getting interest from anyone else, and are we having to turn them away, or is it really just the same handful of groups applying?
Yeah, it's really the same handful of groups. We do try to, any organization that has applied in the past, I send out a direct email to remind them that the grant applications are opening and encourage them to apply. Though Washington Sinfonetta, I think this will be their third year. And so they were new to Falls Church just a few years ago, and was excited to get more involved in the community, and saw this as one way to do that. And certainly we send out through the communications department out just citywide to organizations that we might not know about to hopefully get some potential new applicants, but a lot of repeats, yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for your efforts then.
All right. Unless there's anything else, again, maybe you could take a look and try to reach out to some of these groups, particularly Creative Cauldron, before our next meeting and see if we can try to address some of those needs just a little bit better before we get together.
If I could just say one more thing, I do know that that all of the grantees are eagerly waiting to hear if they've been awarded or not. And if I don't know if we're still in debate about the operationals. I know there are some project grants that are really waiting to get started. So I don't know if it's possible to submit project grants next week if we're still talking about operational grants.
Mr. Z.
So let me be clear about the shortfall that we know about right now. It's is it $3K from last year for property taxes?
I think it's $3K from last year. I think it's $3K from this year as well.
$3K
is
from
my
this year.
understanding.
Well, it just seems like really small potatoes. I say we loan them, give them $6,000, we'll pick it up when they give us back property taxes. Solves that problem.
How would we get it back?
Well, they pay us property taxes, right? No? Yeah, so,
Well,
we can't really waive their taxes. That would be
Right.
unfair.
right. Yeah, that was the decision not to do that. If what you're proposing is not what Creative Cauldron, I think, is, was hoping for. But we'll,
Well, it goes along the same lines that
right.
need to find something creative to do, so to
Okay.
speak.
So we'll work it a little bit more. One thing, just for the council to be, I just want to emphasize there's a committee of citizens that does the work or does the allocations. Staff facilitates that process and organizes it for them. So one question I think we'll just have to kind of go back on is whether we're going to go back to that citizen group to have this conversation, or whether exactly how we'll proceed. But we understand what the council's question is, and we'll see if we can come up with some alternate solutions.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
All right, unless there's anything else, why don't we put this issue to bed, at least for the moment. All right, next item is the transportation grant applications.
Can I just mention one thing while we're transitioning? So in the arts grants, I think there was money allocated for art stops, which were supposed to be meant for the bus stops, getting art in the bus stops. But I think some of that's going to be repurposed to actually getting our utility boxes have art on them. So coming soon, hopefully, which I know this council has pointed out in several walking tours in the past.
Yep, that's right. Did you see that? That's right in the staff report, yeah.
All right, welcome.
So we've been talking all night about spending money. Tonight we're going to talk about grants and money that's coming to the city through our regional partnerships. And Carrie O'Danino is our star staffer who works those. And so she's going to give us an overview of the proposed grant applications. What the goal is to lay out sort of the big strategy on what all the grants would be. So we have a roadmap for the year. And then when we apply for the individual ones, we don't need to have a work session discussion about them. We'll just come straight to council with a requested action on consent. So we put them all together so we can think strategically about them. Ms. O'Danino.
Thank you, Wyatt. I'm Carrie O'Nino. Thank you, Mayor Tarter and members of council for the opportunity to speak tonight. So, as Wyatt mentioned, no formal action is requested at this time. Instead, staff is seeking concurrence from council to prepare proposed transportation grant applications as shown in attachment 2. Formal council action will be requested for each grant application as they're drafted. So before you in attachment 2 is the slate city staff has prepared for grant applications to meet funding needs in the council adopted FY 2019 through 2024 CIP, as well as the transportation CIP delivery schedule. A draft CIP delivery schedule is prepared as part of the CIP process. The CIP delivery schedule is then updated to reflect the adopted CIP. And the schedule of transportation CIP projects in attachment 1 lays out the current CIP delivery schedule and reflects the adopted fiscal year 2019 through 2024 CIP. And the CIP delivery schedule is built with gaps and the assumption that the city will fill them with grants. In terms of methodology, city staff uses the combined CIP delivery schedule and updates that might occur in the next CIP planning cycle to prepare a schedule of grant applications for the upcoming fiscal years. The focus during development of the grant application schedule is on projects already in the FY 2019 through 2024 CIP that are currently active and are short on funding due to higher than anticipated project costs. For projects with stable funding programs, the city will apply for funding in the application cycle immediately prior to the start of the project. And then for projects with competitive funding programs, the city will apply as early as possible and note in the application the expected project start date. So the slate of grant applications includes 14 applications, the majority of which address funding needs in current planned CIP projects. In terms of fiscal impact, city staff work to maximize the use of local funds by looking for grant programs with no or limited local match requirements. So I'm happy to take any questions about the slant of grant applications or the CIP delivery schedule.
All right, Ms. Hardy.
Great, thank you. So all these projects look like good ones. On the grant applications, so similar to the $15 million we got from the NDTA to work on Haycock and Broad, are there any on this list, this 2-page list, where we think we need community support, where we think it's going to be controversial or really competitive? Because I think, for example, missing sidewalk links, for example, would be very popular, I think, among our constituents, and probably people would be happy to show support for that. Are there other ones like that where we think we might need the community's help in getting this money?
So the one that comes to mind is probably the TAP is a fairly competitive grant. City staff was looking at the possibility of using a non-federal resource for that project due to the small application amount and the procurement steps required with the federal funding. But I think probably that source of funding is the most competitive.
That's the one for the WNOD landscape restoration?
Yeah.
Okay.
November 2019, and Carrie just highlighted an important piece is the federal funding. So on this grant cycle, you'll see the red asterisk is the new add to the schedule so that it's easy for council to be aware of which ones are federal dollars because they impact both the cost and time to do the procurement. And since I'm speaking, let me add to Mr. Snyder's email to me after the MVTA meeting that the call for RSTP projects is out there. And we do have that in the queue for the list for applying for the 6th year because we already have 5, and that's an annual sort of add to the next CIP. And Carrie, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so the RSTP funds are distributed on a per capita basis. So typically, they come in through actually a parent project called pedestrian, bicycle, and traffic calming, bridge and traffic calming improvements, and then they're moved to a child project for whatever is in the adopted CIP.
And that's the December 2018 second line on your chart.
So we don't have to do it now, but I'd like us to consider, guys, figuring out which one of these we might want the community to be aware of and help serve their support on, because I think people came through for us last time, and obviously that was a really big amount for 15 million. But if we think that there's buckets of these where people are going to be really interested in seeing us through, let's get some communication out about that so people can help lend their support.
We can definitely keep that in mind. I think the MVTA and then the MVTC I-66 are the two places where there's a little bit of qualitative that goes into the quantitative. It's harder to influence things before the CTB. Not that we don't want to comment, but it's not as effective.
Vice Mayor Connolly, Mr. Snyder.
Are these any new programs, or are these programs we always apply to?
These are all grant programs that we've been applying to. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so we know how to spend the money. It seems like a lot, like one every month almost. We've run into problems in the past where we apply for money and then aren't able to spend it quickly enough, but we're confident that we've got the personnel to enact all of these.
So we actually brought this year to the process of a workload analysis. So that was a concern. And it does include both fiscal year 2019 and 2020 applications, so it looks 2 years out. So
Yeah, so looking at the funding availability, some of it'll come in 23, 24, and so it's trying to fund the entire 6th year. And so you got to plan ahead so that we have the funding. It is grants that we've done before. HSIP is probably the newest of the ones on the list, and those are the federal ones we're using for NTC. And then, as Ms. Bonanino said, 8 of the grant applications are actually for active projects, so we already have workload assigned to them, but just with the rising costs of things or infrastructure undergrounding that we have to move utilities, the costs are higher than estimated originally. Your point is very important to take into account.
Mr. Snyder?
So, thank you very much. I will say that over the past 3 or 4 years, I think we've really risen to the challenge of what's become a much more complicated process. With the upside is there's more money there. The downside is it's harder to get it than it once was. There are fewer and fewer automatic programs and more programs where you have to compete and meet some sort of objective criteria, which if you're a large jurisdiction and you have tons of staff to do, it's comparatively easy. But I think we've really upped our game in this area, and I think the results are good, frankly, from that. But last week we heard a lot of folks who were saying, look, we need not expensive stuff, but we want it quickly. So it seems to me that in addition to maintaining the initiative here, and I want to thank Letty Hardy for getting some folks out as well, in addition to the elected official and staff commitments to these types of projects, it seems to me we're going to have to recognize that we're going to need to come up with some additional local money and a more expeditious process to get it out to deal with these traffic issues. And there's a third issue that relates to that. It's not just about sort of dealing with each sort of element individually, but it's also the larger picture about what does the city need to basically deliver the message to drivers. Your bad behavior is a bad idea anywhere, but if you do it here, you're going to pay a price for it. So I'm wondering if we shouldn't include in our legislative agenda speed cameras, which so far the legislature in Virginia has prohibited. The fact of the matter is that they can be effective. I would love to see far more of those because speeding is one of the consistent complaints we get from citizens. I think where we put our bus stops and how they relate to traffic is perhaps an area of greater city school board cooperation. Because there are some bus stops that work very well and others that don't work so well. So I think we need to put in place some things and not just bring the CACT here, which is a positive thing and relevant, but I think we're going to need to confront the fact that we're going to have to come up with more local money if we're going to address our citizens' concerns. We're going to need to find a process that gets that money out, particularly for the smaller projects, more rapidly. And then we're going to need to look at how to deliver the message that if you're going to drive into the city of Falls Church, you're welcome, but you're only welcome if you comply with our laws and you treat our citizens with respect. And so I'll be interested in seeing how other communities have addressed that. But I know one way is something currently prohibited to us by the legislature, which are speed cameras. So I think we ought to put that in our legislative program. So what I want to do is we had a graphic demonstration last week of our citizens. We've got a list of areas that are that long of relatively small projects. Can we convert any of these funding streams, not taking away from these, but can we make a better pitch for any of these funding streams to help us meet that? But I think if we're going to meet it, we've got to recognize that we're going to have to come up with more local money. We're going to have to come up with a more expedited process. And we're going to have to look for ways to deliver the message more clearly about highway safety and the importance of it in our community. And I would argue that of all the issues we've dealt with tonight, this one is the most fundamental of all. It relates to public safety, and that's why we have governments in the first place. Everything else is terribly important. This is right at the top of what we need to address. So all I'm saying is we now know the size of the issue. We've got a list. I think city staff has tried to deal with some of those, but it seems to me we simply have a resource failure, and I think our citizens have said, this is what we're paying our taxes for. So I'm saying that we collectively, clearly with my involvement, we need to find more of an answer to this situation with the crazy driving behavior than we've seen so far.
I think timing-wise, I'm currently collecting all the ideas from council and the community for the legislative program to bring to you in November, so we can put that in the queue. I think some of these fundings, because of the regional nature and the criteria that you mentioned in terms of congestion mitigation and which roads are eligible, most of these are not going to be able to address those residential roads where the bus stops are and the line of sight and the traffic speeding is. The one area that you do have in your CIP is the NTC program when you have it with local funding, because we can't use the federal money and a lot of these regional monies on all of those non-secondary roads. So in FY19, you have 200,000 of local funding, which is your 30%, not local tax dollars, local funding. And then again in FY22 in the CIP as currently before you, we are starting this fall the process to do the next 6-year CIP, which will go to the Planning Commission in February and to you all in March. So we can look at that, balancing all the funding availability resources. To your bigger point, I think it is the challenge that most of these fundings don't work on our side roads, which serve in the city as that regional connection, because our regional bodies and state don't see them as regional connections. So there's some policy issues there and or partnership with our larger localities that it would probably be helpful that are adjacent to us to work through as well. But some of these smaller ones, and then to the work that Ms. Hardy and Mr. Lookenhouse sent to the email that Wyatt responded to, I think there are some things that are just operational, and if we have sufficient operational funds to do signage and painting, we can do those light solutions more efficiently. So it's a multifaceted approach I would recommend.
Well, hopefully, my suggestion would be we take a hard look at this and come back with more of a comprehensive approach to these all too many intersections, bus stops, all this kind of thing, and really figure out what are the resources we need to deal with it, and either go after them if they're non-city or recognize that our citizens are saying this is where they want their tax money spent. They can't say it any more clearly than they did last week.
Other comments? Ms. Hardy, then Mr. Duncan.
Mr. Duncan, you want to go first since I already had a turn? Do you want to go first since I already had a turn?
Just on attachment 1 on the second page is under neighborhood traffic calming, the 4 cases that are listed and other cases TBD. And there's a number there, 1.6 million. Can you explain what that means? Does that represent the cost of the long list of things that are not in the top 4?
Yeah, so that number should be a cost estimate for the total cost of the other cases.
And other cases as defined by the plan that was updated in February of 2015, or the list that, is reflected in the memo that Ms. Hardy sent around, after our last meeting. In other words, have you done an update of that cost to reflect Ms. Hardy's memo?
No, so that
This cost is from the adopted CIP from last year, so it has not been updated from the this week email dialogue on project needs or the input from the citizens. That would be part of our ongoing and next CIP process. It would include the $636,000 of federal money that we have for NTC in FY20, and that will have some restrictions just based on where eligible projects are for that type of funding.
Okay, the reason I'm barking up this tree, what I hear everybody saying, or at least what my yearning is that as we go into the budget cycle, this is a number that we can share with the community. It's going to cost, pick a number, $2 million to do all the things that are on Ms. Hardy's list. $2 million is 5 cents on the tax rate. Do you want your tax rate to go up 5 cents to address these concerns that you've expressed? And then we have that discussion. If not 5 cents, how about 3? How about 2? How about, in other words, it becomes something other than this kind of ad hoc approach that we have used for time immemorial, which is responsive to whichever wheel squeaks the loudest with the most, appealing case brought before the council. That's being a little harsh. There's more planning involved than that. Obviously, Jeff is doing good work, and we've upped our capacity on this substantially from when I started here in 1986 on the Transportation Committee, but yet still, we are, I think everybody here feels that we are, to some degree, still reactive rather than letting the public understand of the many things that we have to do. This is important, very important, but it is one of the things. It is not the only thing. And so I would personally at least like to have a kind of a number that we could say, if we were going to do everything that we'd like to do, it's going to cost this.
I think that would have two prongs, both the CIP piece, which we'll be updating, and then as we go into the operating budget, because a lot of these things are on both sides of the ledger, and then get it as an aggregate number.
I'm not even talking about, I mean, there's operating costs for more enforcement. That's another separate discussion that I assume would come on through. I trust the, police department would come to us with budget numbers reflecting their views about operational, more robust operational attention to traffic calming. But it's even the light solutions.
Yeah, and a lot of
even
those
the light solutions cost some money.
Yep.
And knowing what that amount of money is just helpful so that when people fill up the room, we can tell them, all right, here's what it's going to cost.
Yeah, we'll work with Public Works for that, because a lot of those things are the signage and the painting and the parking slots, and that's on the operating side, and we can bring it so you see an aggregate look.
So are you going to address the Hardy budget increase? The
Yeah, I did
tax
not
increase?
advocate for 5 cents on the tax rate for that. For the record.
You heard it first here tonight. Another tax increase. Thank you, Ms. Hardy.
So looking through the CIP list, I was looking at all the projects that are delayed. Again, all really good stuff on there. It seems like for the most part, things are delayed because funding is coming in later than expected, correct? I wanted to hone in on the downtown ones, given the attention this council has paid on improving kind of our downtown area. So it looks like my understanding of the funding for the downtown improvements is the funding's coming in later than planned. We had thought the project would be about $4 million, but we've actually set aside $480,000 of local money that's sitting there, and that's what I think Jim Snyder had brought to the EDA probably 2 or 3 weeks ago for kind of their endorsement of kind of a set of improvements to the Park Avenue corridor. Is that my understanding of kind of where the money's coming from and what?
His proposal would pull $240,000 out of the CIP project to do some of those activities. This 480, some of it is already matched and committed, and it's 30% money, and then the 240 was what the EDA was exploring. The funding award delay letter is the change in SMART scale, which has added a complexity that we're trying to undo, where instead of giving us the money as we asked for design and construction, they're spreading it out, and that's why your budget amendment showed $95,000 for one award, which obviously is not going to do much for a $4 million project. This project is also underfunded by $2 million due to the cost of undergrounding on Park Avenue, so we're doing some whole scope review, and the proposal that the EDA is looking at is part of the staff's meeting next week.
Got it. So my question is the list that the EDA looked at kind of going to go forward, or it sounds like more internal discussions needed?
We need some more internal discussion because we want to make sure that we're not, similar to your park discussion, doing something that then we're going to have to undo to do the full project. So we want to make sure we're fully vetting the options.
Yes. So going back to the, I guess, infamous now Hardy list, what's on that list that I think I would like to be considered is the missing sidewalk on the corner of Park and Virginia. So I think it's been long asked for, even long before I was on council. People have asked for it on Virginia. Clearly, it's part of the Great Streets improvement work on Park Avenue, especially as we think about improvements to the library. This could really help that intersection. So if that is something that could fit within the money we have, I'd love to see that happen.
Yeah, and that would actually be a scope change, so something that we'll look at, because this particular grant that you called out actually stops at Virginia at the library, and it's 1 block more, so we just need to make sure we're using local money or it will fit into the SMART scale.
It just seems like we've got a house under construction right at the corner there, and I want to make sure we take advantage of that because that doesn't happen very often, where you've got community alignment money plus actually a house that's going to go under construction who's okay with adding a sidewalk.
That'll be part of the staff meeting next week.
Vice Mayor Connolly?
This is actually just tangential to what Ms. Hardy just asked about the money the EDA is looking at. Just the proposal went to the EDA. Will that come back to us as a final proposal if things get moved around?
Yes, because we need to sort out the allocation and compliance because it's in the adopted CIP, so this is a change.
Okay. One of the things that comes to mind tonight as we go through the parks plan and their master planning and the CIP planning, the pocket park that the EDA has been chasing down for 2 years now was outside of this whole process because it's something that they wanted to do, and it hasn't worked. So I appreciate the process that staff is putting in to make sure all these things work, and I would request that the next time anyone has an idea to try something different like that, it fits into this process. And I know that many staff bent over backwards to help the EDA spend the money that they had, but in the end, it didn't follow the process that, even though it takes a longer time, does indeed work. And I think we just need to keep that in mind going forward when there are sums of money to be spent, that it needs to fit into the plan that the city has laid out and has thought out carefully.
We'll certainly can keep that in mind, and it does impact work staff load, so we do need to look at the allocation that way.
This is for the city attorney. With respect to new construction, do we have authority, either within our own code or by state code, to require sidewalk as part of new home construction?
Not if it's just a single-family home. There's some authority if it's a subdivision for more than one lot.
And the authority, is that under state code?
Yes.
So you're saying we do not have authority under state code if there's not a subdivision of land?
Right.
To require a sidewalk?
Sidewalk for a house, a single house that's being built, that's correct.
Can we, quote, ask for it? I mean, in terms of not necessarily demanding it, but make that as a suggestion or a comment to a site plan application?
Well, you'd want to be cautious about acting as though it wasn't going to get approval for that reason, but certainly you can always suggest that they might want to do that voluntarily.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to find a way when we get new construction, such as the one at, I guess it's Virginia and Park, to try to get those little pieces of the sidewalk replaced. It's just really tough to have an area that doesn't have sidewalk.
Yeah, I think the way that the state code allows you to get those kind of sidewalks is there's an assessment process that you can go into but it involves, you don't sort of collect the money right away, and it's a little bit more complicated to assess somebody for the city to put in the sidewalk.
I would certainly like to hear more about that. I mean, maybe not at this moment, but if there's a mechanism, even if it's cumbersome, to get sidewalks where we don't have any, I think a lot of us would probably like to know how we might go about it, even if it's lengthy and not the simplest thing in the world.
The Mayor VML is introducing legislation this fall to make it possible for cities to assess and collect the money for sidewalks in particular, and not have to spend the money immediately to put them in, but to aggregate them and put them in at the proper time and place.
Good, thanks for the update.
Yeah.
A couple other just thoughts, not really related, frankly, to our discussion entirely, but I think it's important, Mr. City Manager, as you plan our budget, to keep in mind the discussion we're having tonight and last week about wanting to do more traffic calming and to have a dedicated stream of revenue to do that. And so I would just ask you to keep that in mind as you put your budget together, that I think it's certainly a priority for this council.
Understood. I think that's a good discussion for the budget guidance that will be coming up very shortly. I do want to give a bit of a plug. You know, we worked hard this year to not overpromise on grants. So this slate of grant applications is smaller than you've seen in probably the last 3 years. And most of them are on the out years. And we are trying to be very deliberate about executing what we have. And part of that is, I think, a little bit of a mindset that in transportation planning, nimbleness and agility is not a virtue. Doggedness and planning and executing your plan is a virtue. We spend my diagnosis is, and I think everybody kind of has their own angle on it, but I think we spend too much staff time thinking up new projects or shifting existing projects. And sometimes we shift them for good reasons, because once we got into them and did the engineering, it ended up being much more expensive than we thought when we were just planning it. But I think there's just too much churn on ideas, and instead we have really good planning. I think our foundation is really strong, when we put a project on, we get those solid cost estimates. Then we put a fence around it, and we execute that, and don't let people come in and make it bigger, make it smaller, change the scope. We just need to execute. We spend a tremendous amount of time replanning projects that are already in queue, and we want to execute. I think everybody is motivated. We are blessed with a community and a council that is absolutely clear in what you want. We get it, we hear it, and we want to execute. And part of that is not trying to cram so much in that everything sort of spills out and we spend all our time talking and not executing. That's kind of what we're trying to work through, and ask for the council's understanding of that and support for it.
Okay, I'm just going to continue talking for a bit longer, if you don't mind. One, I would just say I heard some positive feedback on, quote, community policing, in terms of the police presence after our discussion last week, and I guess the police were at the bus stop maybe the following day. I would just encourage more of that if it's possible to do. I think the visibility really helps, and I think particularly at places with a lot of kids congregating, it's important. And so I would just encourage you to maybe encourage the chief and give her some positive feedback on the efforts so far. But I think it's a good idea, and one that we spend a lot of time focusing on Route 7, but I think there's plenty of other arterial or tertiary roads that could probably use some police presence as well. And lastly, I guess I would just make a comment, the idea that Jim Snyder and the EDA about maybe shifting some money over. I just want to make sure, and maybe this has already been sort of addressed, that whatever we might do in that regard is consistent with the overall big picture plan, so that we're not kind of reinventing the wheel twice over. So, but I do like the idea of getting some stuff out there and moving it along and not waiting for the perfect day when everything's in place.
Yep, that's part of the core of our meeting next week with our internal staff team.
Okay, well, that's all I've got. Does anyone else have anything else, or should we move on to council schedule? We do have a closed session for later this evening as well. Are there any council schedule or other requests?
Under other requests, while folks are looking at the schedule, so there's been some email traffic about the boxes on the streets that have various circulars and
Thank you very much.
publications, and thank you, Carrie. Various papers in them, and some of them seem to be functioning as trash cans. I mean, you open them up and mostly there's garbage in them. And there was a staff comment that it didn't seem clear that anybody has a God-given First Amendment right to put such things on our streets, and it never really occurred to me that that was not the case. So, could we look into that and reduce the clutter of said boxes if they are, commercial and not even being used for the purposes that they were placed? I mean, now that so much stuff is online, maybe this stuff is left over from the previous century and nobody's just bothered to pick it up.
Yeah, we can look into it. I think probably the crux of the matter is there a process by which we permit them?
Yeah.
And then with that, are there standards? So let's get an answer to that, and we can get back.
And if there's some, limitations on us, that we can get around or appeal to Richmond to allow us to deal with. I mean, got to be places like Williamsburg that don't allow these things, I mean, in Williamsburg, everything looks the same, and so they obviously, some jurisdictions are allowed to regulate these things in some ways that we have not bothered with. Okay, thanks.
All right, Ms. Hardy.
Bike share, I meant to ask this before Carrie left. What's the latest and greatest on that? And then two kind of scheduling things. If Carol and White, if you could get back to us on scheduling the gun ordinance update Sounds like it's mostly ready to go, and we just need to get on the calendar. And then I'd like to know whether we're going to be on track to update the senior tax relief with getting that task force together before the end of the year.
On bike share, we are waiting for a final VDOT and federal approval on our contract awards so that we can award the station acquisition and maintenance so that we could proceed. So it is nip and tuck. Whether we'll see anything this year, we are looking at spring now, because putting it out in the winter is just not the time to deploy bike share stations. So Carrie's working it really hard, and we're escalating it at VDOT and the feds.
Are any of those bikes electric bikes?
I believe not. I think the stations have solar power for the functioning, but they're,
Not for the station, I mean for the bikes themselves.
they're not
Okay.
electric.
Although I think Motivate is looking at having a e-bike option, and I've just overheard that, but.
That's what I thought too.
Whether they would work in these docking stations, I think the intent or the hope is that they would, but. Ms. Acosta, on the senior tax relief is out this week, and so as soon as she gets back, we'll get an update out to council on that.
I think coming up here too, something we've sort of alluded to in the past is scooters and how they might be turning up in the city, and how we might want to either regulate them or at least examine rules and regulations related to them. So I think that's something we ought to be thinking about as time goes on as well.
Yeah, Arlington's officially allowing a pilot, and so I think we should at least stay close in touch with how they're managing it. And I think they issued a whole bunch of like rules around, you know, where people should ride them. They're in our city, like they're at East Falls Church. They're on the WNOD.
There have been sightings.
Yes, so.
So it's time now for the nanny state to swing into full action. And
We
I'd
could just
actually
watch
ask
it for a little while.
I'd actually ask the city attorney. I mean, I don't think we should allow anybody to ride them in the city of Falls Church unless they're wearing a helmet. You know, maybe I'm going to get beat up for that, but I'd rather get beat up for it than, you know, have to go to the first, you know, event of somebody who cracked their head open.
Yeah.
So I would like to know what our rights are as a city to require helmets to be worn for scooters, any motorized device.
Right, and that's just one I haven't gotten to yet, but I'll get it on the list. And I think we're going to schedule the gun ordinance for, as well as the noise ordinance for the first cycle in November to start with.
And the police are going to put in a request for a faster scooter so that they can enforce the helmet rule.
Like armored scooter with, you know.
Can you give a little more detail on the noise ordinance?
Do you want to, or?
I can, or you can if you.
Well, if you're up to speed.
Yeah. The noise ordinance is really an update that is overdue. Several years ago, the court in a Virginia Beach case held that using a standard of noise that's offensive to a reasonable person is unconstitutionally vague. And so what we've done is, like many jurisdictions around the state, we're taking the ordinance and updating it to refer to standards such as audible 100 feet from outside a building when it's the noise is in the building, things like that, the distance and the noise being plainly audible. We do not have decibel meters at this time, so we're not putting in standards of decibel, but what we've gone to is we've taken out the standard of reasonable person, which was throughout our ordinance, and gone to these other kinds of standards, such as types of noise like construction noise before 7 in the morning and things like that.
Does this relate to automobiles that travel on our roads or no?
There, I believe, and I'd have to look back at it, but I believe there is a provision a provision related to noise emanating from automobiles, but I would want to verify that. I can get back to you on. I can send you the
Just
draft
motor
if you
vehicles
like.
in general? I was wondering about that.
In terms of the noise that they make, again, I'm sorry, I'd have to look back at the specifics of it.
I was going to say, as relates to the noise ordinance, having a little bit of experience in other jurisdictions' noise ordinance, I do think having a decibel, which is a really entirely objective measure of it, is much easier to deal with than somebody can hear it at 100 feet or whatever. I think that's fair.
Right. And that just requires an investment in noise meters and good training for people who are going to enforce it, which I think we don't really have, or there's no plan for undertaking that effort at this time. And that's why we haven't done it. There are standards in our current ordinance. There are some decibel standards, but they haven't been enforced because we just don't have the measurement mechanism at this point.
I can't imagine it's that expensive, though, to get a whatever decimeter or whatever. Yeah.
It's both the equipment and the staff actually, besides being trained, have to be certified, so you have to have them 24/7 available. So the chief, and when this comes forward, could provide more information on that.
Well, that's exactly right, Assistant City Manager. I have a radar gun that I use frequently, but, it would never be admissible anywhere else except to my neighbors.
Could I share
Yes.
with everyone while we're here, the VDOT had a meeting last Thursday about the bicycle bridge at the Arlington border, just to show us the latest. And Tim Stevens was there from the Planning Commission, and Bill Ackerman from the CACT, and a few folks from Arlington. It was not a contentious activity. It seems that most everybody is satisfied with the design, which is more modern than the one that we have now on the west side. It's much wider. It's 20 feet wide. It's lit sort of at shoulder level rather than above, with downward casting lights. And they've tried to lighten the heft of it with open support beams. 3 of the 5 are sort of open support beams rather than heavy, full mortar beam. So I think it looks nice. There's a landscape and tree planted area underneath the bridge. At any rate, the only people who had concerns were those who were in the near vicinity and were wondering what VDOT's protocols for construction and, noise abatement during the process, which is understandable. Sounds like that it'll start in next year and in one way or another be going on for a couple of years, and it's going to be a mess. It's going to slow things down. They're going to have to close traffic on at least one lane coming off 66. So people are going to feel it coming into and going out of town. But the final product should be good. And it's not true that it's going to be named after Dave Snyder, but I'm working on that. So.
All right. Anything else?
Sorry, one more scheduling thing. We talked about a lot of CIP things tonight, but do we have a quarterly CIP discussion plan so we can talk about it some more?
Coming up soon. The last one was in August, if I recall.
Okay.
All right. Anything else? Okay.
Just council request. I had asked, I think last week or the week before, for a line item budget from the EDA about how much they spent on that pocket park. And then 2 scheduling things. This morning at Mary Ellen Henderson Middle School, there was a naturalization ceremony. It was amazing. There were 20 new citizens sworn in from 16 countries, and they were there and did their oath of swearing in, and for the 7th grade classes who learn about citizenship. It was really moving, very well done. And tomorrow morning there's a attempt to do a record-breaking food packing event. It's at 8 o'clock at Mary Ellen Henderson. I think Celeste sent an invitation out to everyone, but that should also be a Rip Roaring Middle School event.
All right. Anything else? We do have a closed session this evening, so unless there's anything else, why don't we move on to that portion of the evening? I'm going to go ahead and start the motion, and then we'll go ahead and get the cameras and TVs turned off and go into closed session. Yes. Upon a motion made by Councilmember
Connolly.
and seconded by Councilmember
Hardy.
and passed by a vote of City Council. Council went in a closed session pursuant to Virginia Code Section 2.2-3711A28 for discussion or consideration of information subject to exclusion in Subdivision 11 of Virginia Code Section 2.2-3705.6. We're making such information public prior to entering into an interim or comprehensive agreement will adversely affect the financial interest or bargaining position of the public entity, and Virginia Code Section 2.2-3711A5 for discussion or consideration of prospective business or industry or expansion of an existing business or industry where no previous announcement has been made of the business or industry's interest in locating facilities in the community. Councilmember Connolly?
Yes.
Duncan?
Yes.
Hardy?
Yes.
Lichtenhouse?
Yes.
Snyder?
Yes.
Z?
Yes.
Tarter? Yes? Okay. Why don't we take a short break and let the cameras and mics get turned off, and then we'll reconvene.